Hello, this is Pastor Barley. I pray you will find this series, What is Mystery Babylon, by Pastor Emry, as stirring and powerful as I have. Please remember as you listen to these tapes that they were produced many years ago and the prices quoted for printed material are not current. In fact, some of the material is no longer available from America's Promise. Please refer to our current literature list for up-to-date prices on books and pamphlets we now offer. It is our prayer that these tapes will help you know and understand God's will for you in these end-time days. Please remember that this ministry needs your prayers and support. Your giving does make a difference, and it allows this ministry to reach thousands with the truth. May our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, guide you and keep you in His love is my prayer. Thank you.
In Revelation chapter 17, John writes of a fearful vision of a woman which reigned over the kings of the earth, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. A great antichrist world-ruling system which would control all of the kings or rulers of the earth, and which would bring death and destruction upon the followers of Jesus to the extent that she was drunk with their blood. Her name is given in verse 5 of Revelation 17, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. I am going to discuss this mystery, Babylon the Great, in this broadcast and in several more to answer the question, what is Mystery Babylon? Christendom hears a lot of preaching on a future Antichrist, some great world ruler who is supposed to appear on the world scene in the future, take control of all nations, and bring a time of tribulation upon the earth. Most who teach this insist that the Christians will not be on the earth when this happens, but will have been translated to heaven, there to remain with Jesus Christ until the 7 years of the Antichrist rule is over. We'll get on with our Bible study in just a moment or so, and while you are getting your Bibles and calling a friend to tell them to tune in on this program, I will list the free literature which you may have in our January packet. You will receive my 24-page illustrated pamphlet, actually a small book, titled Billions for the Bankers, Debts to the People. This is a simple treatise on the operation of the international financiers which brings about wars in which the masses of the earth suffer untold misery and death, while the moneylenders and the international corporation conglomerates reap millions in war profits and plunder. The recent so-called war in Vietnam is a prime example of a war carried on by the rulers of two nations, the United States of America on one side and Russia on the other, in which the war is fought not on the land of either of those nations, but on a land which is thousands of miles away, a land which is almost totally destroyed in the conflict, millions of her people being killed and several millions more maimed and crippled. And when the war is over, international oil cartels, munitions manufacturers, and the international bankers are billions of dollars richer, while the people of Russia, the people of Vietnam, and the people of America are not only less well off, but are hundreds of billions of dollars in debt to the moneylenders. The people of Russia, China, and North Vietnam were told the war was to bring victory for communism over South Vietnam. The people of the United States and South Vietnam were told the war was to bring defeat to communism in South Vietnam. Neither of these goals were accomplished. In fact, the political condition of both South Vietnam and North Vietnam is exactly what it was before the fighting began. Since the publicly stated goals of the war were not accomplished for either side, was the actual goal something else? Obviously it was. For the men who rule Russia and the men who rule America were friends before the Vietnam War, they remained friendly during the Vietnam War, and they are cooperating friends now after our armies are withdrawn. Was the actual goal of this war the physical destruction of South Vietnam, which was accomplished? Was it the demoralizing and destruction of the United States military power, which was accomplished? And was it the adding of $150 billion to the debts of the U.S. taxpayers, which was accomplished? My pamphlet, Billions for the Bankers, Debts to the People, will answer that question for you. Along with that, I will send you a reprint of a sermon preached in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1773, titled, Civil Rulers Are God's Ministers. In this, the preacher made it plain just what politicians are supposed to be, according to the Bible, rather than what they are today. You'll perhaps be surprised by what ministers of 200 years ago taught about politicians. The third item in the January packet is a short article by Professor Revelo P. Oliver, Christianity, Religion of the West. All of these are free for the asking by writing to me at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Each of them will give you additional understanding of our Bible study this month titled, What is Mystery Babylon? Along with the packet, you will receive our book and track list, a list of over 200 Bible study sermons available on tape, and a radio log where these broadcasts can now be heard in most of America. My name is Pastor Emry. My address, again, America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Just ask for the free January packet of literature. All right, let's turn to the book of Revelation. We saw in chapter 1 that John said these visions he was shown were of things which, quote, must shortly come to pass, unquote. A reasonable interpretation of that, since the very end of the visions in Revelation 22 is of the great kingdom age, when Jesus would rule upon the earth, is that these visions in the earlier chapters must be a preview of the history of the world in the time leading up to the kingdom age. Our specific goal in this series is to identify Mystery Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18, so we read part of those chapters, enough to see that she is a world dictatorship, that she is Antichrist and Antichristian, being responsible for the deaths of untold numbers of Christians, and that she must be and will be totally and completely destroyed before the return of Christ in Revelation 19. In verse 21 of Revelation 18, near the end of John's vision of her destruction, we read, And a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. To understand the prophetic events leading up to the destruction of Mystery Babylon before the Kingdom Age, we should begin by reading the visions John saw before the vision of Revelation 17 and Revelation 18. Let's begin in Revelation 15, verse 1. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. Whatever these would be, this would be the last of and the end of God's wrath. Last week we saw that the prophet spoke of a time they called the day of the Lord, in which God's wrath would be poured out upon the wicked upon the earth. It is most probable that the pouring out of these 7 vials, then, would be during the time the prophets called the day of the Lord. After John sees the angels with the vials, and before he sees them poured out upon the earth, he goes on. Verse 2, Revelation 15. And I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. The number referred to here, of course, is the number 666, given in chapter 13, verse 18, and referred to in chapter 14. 666 is the number of man, or of man's rule, upon the earth in opposition to the rule of Christ, or what we would call Antichrist. Now, many teach this will be one man, yet future, who will rule after the Christians are raptured off the earth. I do not want to take time to cover 666 in this series, but the number is already in use on a worldwide basis. As an example, textiles being exported from Red China have the number 666 imprinted on the cloth. The Jews use the number 666 in their military designations in Israeli, and the number 666 is being used by the United States Treasury Department. You can obtain a copy of their small publication on illegal weapons, and on the front cover they have a Treasury agent badge, and the badge number, just as plain as can be, is 666. If you would like a copy of that, just write to the U.S. Treasury Department, Washington, D.C., and ask for their publication on illegal guns, or you can obtain one from your congressman. As some of my listeners would know, also, the men of the Protestant Reformation in Europe of several centuries ago pointed out that the Latin title of the Roman popes converted to Roman numerical values totaled exactly 666. That title in Latin is still the official title of the Roman popes today. So the number 666 is not future. It has been with us for centuries and is being openly used by Antichrist people and organizations in the world today. Anyway, the people in verse 2 of Revelation 15 are identified as those who have gotten the victory over the beast, his image, his mark, and the number of his name, and then in verse 3, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Two songs are referred to here, the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb, and the substance of the songs is then given briefly in the rest of these two verses, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. Now remember that all that is described here in sound and in vision is symbolic of something much greater, something covering a much longer period of time than the few minutes it might have taken John to see the vision. Briefly, the songs are the preaching and witnessing by the followers of Jesus during this age, from the time of John's vision right on down to the return of Jesus Christ. All who have not succumbed to the Antichrist, the system of man, which is partially designated by the number 666, have proclaimed the gospel of the Lamb, and they have been doing that for over 1900 years. The song of the Lamb is, literally, the preaching of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for the redemption of Israel and the salvation of the world. But what is the song of Moses? We don't hear a lot of preaching about Moses these days from the churches, and yet John saw these saints singing both the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb in victory over 666. I have a series of 8 sermons, each about 45 minutes long, titled The Song of Moses. They are available on 4 90-minute cassettes for an offering of $10 toward this ministry. I have a weekly tape ministry in which subscribers receive each week a 45-minute Bible study sermon from my church and this 30-minute radio broadcast on tape. They listen to the tapes and then either return them for reuse or they can purchase them. And during the time I was preaching this series on the Song of Moses, practically every family on our tape ministry purchased and kept all of the series, many of them writing to say they had never heard the Song of Moses before and were amazed and thrilled at how these sermons opened up their understanding of the Old Testament and of prophecy. Some wrote to tell me they had listened to the series 2 and 3 and more times. One man told me he listened to it about 12 times in the year after I preached the Song of Moses. That may sound a little ridiculous to some of my newer listeners, but we do have some real Bible students who follow this ministry. Many of them would put most of the ministers in the country to shame with their love and knowledge of God's Word. You may have that series, The Song of Moses, on the 4 cassette tapes for an offering of $10 to America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Let's go on in John's vision. Revelation 15, verse 5. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened, and the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God who liveth forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Now the next chapter then goes on to describe the pouring out upon the earth of these 7 vials of God's wrath, and we'll read and discuss them briefly as we have time, but first I want to point out to my listeners a very important truth revealed in the last verses of chapter 15. John saw a vision of the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven, and he said, the temple was filled with the smoke from the glory of God and from his power, but listen, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. In that phrase alone is proof that much of what is taught about heaven today is actually falsehood. Almost every denominational church in America and the Catholic Church teaches that Christians go to heaven to be with Christ immediately upon their death. Many Protestant denominations and most of the so-called non-denominational churches further teach that the rest of us will go to heaven to be with Christ in the so-called rapture of the church. They further teach that all of these vials of God's wrath here in Revelation 15 and 16 are going to be poured out upon the earth in the 7 years of great tribulation after we are in heaven. But John wrote rather plainly here that no man could enter the temple of the tabernacle in heaven until the 7 plagues were fulfilled or completed. Where in the world does that leave you folks with your hope of the rapture? Well, it leaves you without biblical foundation, at least in Revelation 15. Now I do not deny but that the believers will be in the temple of God sometime. For Jesus Christ himself said in Revelation 3:12, Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. And of course it was the overcomers which John was writing about in chapter 15. And he said, no man could enter the temple of God until the 7 plagues were finished. Let's go on in chapter 16 and read about the 7 plagues as far as we have time today, and I'll have to be rather brief on them, for I want to spend most of my radio time in this series on Mystery Babylon herself in Revelation 17 and 18. Revelation 16, the angels now have the 7 vials of God's wrath. Verse 1, And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worship his image. The wrath here falls on those who follow the system designated by the number 666. Verse 3, And the second angel poured out his vial upon the earth, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shall be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. Now, if these are all yet future, we can go into any realm of speculation we want to as to what they mean. They obviously cannot be taken literally, for if they were, the second vial would have killed all life in the sea, and the third vial would have turned all the waters of the earth to blood. No, these are symbolic visions of great plagues or tribulations which were to come upon the earth sometime after John saw the vision and before the return of Jesus Christ at the end of this age. And many things have happened which easily fit, symbolically, these great plagues of God's wrath upon the earth. Let me just list a few. The dispersion and killing of most of the Jews in Old Jerusalem by the Romans. The persecution and death of millions of followers of Jesus by the Roman Empire. The destruction of imperial Rome by the Goths and the Vandals. The sack and pillage of most of southern Europe, from the Black Sea to Gaul by Attila the Hun. The rise of the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by a succession of popes, which persecuted and put to death untold numbers of the faithful in Christ, even up to 300 years ago. The drive of Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes from Asia to the very gates of Vienna and Berlin, and they burned to the ground every European city they conquered, raped the women, and killed and enslaved every male above 10 years of age. The conquest of the old Greek Empire and most of the Mediterranean lands by the Ottoman Empire, which lasted 1,335 years, the exact time given in the book of Daniel. The so-called Crusades to the Holy Land and the city of Jerusalem, which lasted off and on for 2 centuries and brought death to hundreds of thousands in southern Europe and in the land of Palestine itself. The Black Plague of less than 500 years ago, which killed between 25% and 30% of all the people then alive upon the earth. With such calamities and vast destructions upon the people of the earth during the first 1,500 years of the Christian era, isn't it amazing that today almost every minister reading these prophecies of great tribulation say, oh, This is all future. This will happen in 7 years after we Christians are gone. We won't be here. And on and on and on. Don't they know history? Don't you know history? And why? Ignore such plain statements in God's Word in verse 8 of Revelation 15, which says, no man can enter the temple of God until after these tribulations brought upon the earth by God's wrath are fulfilled. Even verse 6 of Revelation 16 says some of those were punished because, quote, they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, unquote. That is the same accusation made against Mystery Babylon in Revelation 17, the Mystery Babylon which is destroyed by the 6th and 7th vials of God's wrath. How could they shed the blood of saints and prophets if the Christians are to be taken off the earth safe and alive before these things come to pass? Well, my time is almost gone for today. We'll continue in Revelation 16 next week, God willing, and go on to find out what is Mystery Babylon, the last great Antichrist system destroyed by God before the ushering in of the Kingdom Age. This is Pastor Emry saying goodbye. God bless you. Read your Bible and pray for Christian America. This is Pastor Emry with the second broadcast titled, What is Mystery Babylon? The Scarlet Woman of Revelation 17 and Revelation 18. Mystery Babylon and the beast which she rides are read in those passages. Could Mystery Babylon be connected with red communism? Stay tuned. Revelation 17. John saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And in verse 18, the angel told John, the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Bible students have understood for centuries that this woman, Mystery Babylon, was or was to be a great worldwide dictatorship ruling all nations of the earth. Today, there exist primarily two schools of teaching on Mystery Babylon. One is what we call the futurist interpretation of prophecy, that all of the book of Revelation from chapter 6 on, and most of the prophecies in the Old Testament, are to be fulfilled in the future. The other school of teaching, and that to which I subscribed, is called the historicist interpretation of prophecy, and that is that both the Old Testament prophecies and the book of Revelation were and are a revelation or a revealing of the history between Christ's first advent and his second advent and on into the kingdom. In other words, much of prophecy and revelation has already been fulfilled in the last 1900 years. What is happening right now is further fulfillment of those same prophecies and the visions of Revelation, and if we understand them aright, we can see the future course of world history which will come upon us in the coming years. The futurists say the next event is the rapture, or the removal of the Christian believers from the earth, and then, and only then, can the book of Revelation be fulfilled. But we say the book of Revelation is being fulfilled right now, and has already in great part been fulfilled. And it is happening while we are here, while the Christians are upon the earth. And if we read the Scriptures right, we will remain here right on through the last great conflict, the destruction of Mystery Babylon, and the coming in of the kingdom as described in the last 2 chapters of Revelation. So you stay tuned to this broadcast as we continue to read and discuss the last chapters of Revelation in this series titled, What is Mystery Babylon? First, I'll repeat our January offer of free literature, which you may have by writing to me at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Our January packet will include my 24-page illustrated pamphlet titled, Billions for the Bankers, Debts to the People. As you read this, you will see the almost total economic and financial control exerted over all nations of the world by the multi-billion-dollar world banks operating out of London, Paris, Switzerland, New York, Tokyo, and all of the other major cities of the world. When we get into Revelation 18, you will see that it describes a world economic system, a system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, just as we see happening in our nation and in the world today. We estimate the readership of this one pamphlet has been between 300,000 and 500,000 people in the year since I wrote it. I've had letters from all over America and Canada, even from Europe, Africa, Australia, and South America, telling me this pamphlet is one of the easiest to understand articles they had ever read on the money system, which makes debtors out of all workers and millionaires out of all money lenders. Billions for the bankers, debts to the people. The second item in the free January packet is a reprint we did of a 200-year-old sermon preached before the Massachusetts Bay Colony, King's Governor, and the King's Council on the 4th chapter of Romans, titled Civil Rulers Are God's Ministers. I think you'll enjoy that and be instructed with the exposition of God's Word to the politicians of that day. It was preached in 1773, just before the American Revolution. And you'll also receive a copy of Professor Oliver's article, Christianity, Religion of the West. All 3 of these will help you see and understand this radio series on Mystery Babylon a little better. My address again, America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. That's Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll send along with that a list of the other publications we have available and a list of over 200 sermons on Bible prophecy available on tape. Now, if you have your Bibles, turn again with me to the book of Revelation, and we'll continue our study on what is Mystery Babylon. Last week we read through verse 7 of Revelation 16 in our preliminary study to set the stage for Revelation 17 and 18, which describe Mystery Babylon. And I'll review just briefly for listeners who might be hearing this broadcast for the first time. Chapter 15 tells of the 7 vials of God's wrath, which were given to the 7 angels to be poured out upon the earth as 7 last plagues. And one of the most important verses in that chapter is verse 8, which says, No man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Since we are told by Jesus Christ in Revelation 3:12 that he would make overcomers a pillar in the temple of my God, it seems that they must await the completion of the 7 plagues of Revelation 15 before they can enter God's temple. That, of course, contradicts the popular and almost universal teaching today that overcomers, or Christians, go immediately to stand in God's presence in His temple at their death. Anyway, then in Revelation 16, the angels are ordered to go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth, which then John saw them do, still, of course, in vision. We read through verse 7 of the first of these 3 vials being poured out. One put a sore upon men who had the mark of the beast, the second made the sea as blood, and the third one made the rivers and fountains of waters blood. I must repeat again, these cannot be taken literally. John was seeing the tribulations and violence of the earth's history in symbolism, in vision. And the earth's history is just that, a history of wars, of destruction, and of the violent deaths of millions upon millions of people in great and continuing calamities brought upon the earth because men, so far, have refused God's rule over themselves and the earth. And they've gone in the way of Satan and man's own rebellion, bringing God's wrath or judgment upon them. I mentioned just a few of the plagues which the earth has suffered last week. Perhaps I should repeat them, since most of my listeners have heard so often that all of these plagues in Revelation 15 and 16 are yet future, and perhaps you have never considered that they might already be past history. A few of the plagues and destructions which have come upon the earth, I mentioned, were the slaughter of millions of followers of Christ by imperial Rome, followed by the destruction of the Roman Empire by the Goths and the Vandals, and internal decay. The sweep of the Huns under Attila, destroying most of Europe from the Caspian Sea to Gaul. Such a scourge upon what was then part of the new Christendom that Christian writers later referred to Attila as the sword of the Lord, and said he was a scourge sent from God for the blasphemy of the nations against God. The rise of papal Rome, with hundreds of thousands of professing Christians persecuted and killed for possession of parts of the Bible in writing, or for refusal to partake of the sacraments of the Roman priests. The destruction of much of Eastern Europe by the Mongols under Genghis Khan. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, driving Christendom west and north and keeping it from the Eastern Mediterranean for over 13 centuries. The so-called Crusades during that time to recapture the city of Jerusalem. The Crusades resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, including tens of thousands of children who perished on what was known as the Children's Crusade. The Black Death, a plague which overswept Europe and much of Asia, killing an estimated 1/4 of all the people alive upon the earth at that time. And one later one, which I didn't mention, the Napoleonic Wars, in which every monarch of the Holy Roman Empire was deposed, Rome was occupied, the Pope taken captive, and the political power of the Pope over Europe, over Mexico, and Western America was ended. All of this, of course, accompanied with death and destruction so vast it staggers the imagination to contemplate. And still today, with this history of the past 2,000 years, the majority of preachers speak of a future 7-year period and say, oh, that 7 years will be the fulfillment of all of these great tribulations, worse than anything in the past. And they say that all of these things in the last chapters of Revelation will be fulfilled during that future 7-year reign of the Antichrist. Well, it would be laughable if it were not preached by so many and believed by millions of professing Christians. Let's read on now in Revelation 16 as we set the stage for Mystery Babylon. Revelation 16, beginning in verse 8. And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, And power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. Now I believe it is possible that the plague of this fifth vial was the destruction of Papal Rome's Holy Empire by the Napoleonic Wars. Notice here, the wrath of God is poured out upon the seat of the beast, and we'll be discussing that beast in more detail when we get into Revelation 17, where John saw the woman riding upon that beast. And of course the wars, as such, brought no Christian revival to Europe, no repentance, no turning to God, just as we read here, that they repented not of their deeds. Verse 12, And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits, like frogs, come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And now here in these verses, we are reading those which are often read today and usually explained as being the preparation for the great battle which the futurists say will be fought during the 7-year reign of the Antichrist over in the Mid-East. And I've heard them say that the drying up of the river Euphrates, which they always interpret as literal, with the actual drying up of the river itself, would allow the hordes of Chinese and other Asiatic armies to march directly against the Jews in Palestine and to fight the Battle of Armageddon, which is mentioned in verse 16. Many of them have maps in which they show the maneuvering of the armies of Russia and Egypt against the Jews, and they usually quote Ezekiel 38 and 39 as additional proof of the so-called Russian invasion of Old Palestine. But again, I remind my listeners, these visions are not actual, they are not literal, they are symbolic and stand for something other than what the actual words describe, and they must be explained that way. First of all, if this is taken at all literally, as the futurists do, we have a contradiction here between this statement in Revelation 16 and the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39. We just read here in verse 12 that the sixth vial was to prepare the way of the kings of the east. But in Ezekiel 38 and 39, the prophet makes it quite plain that the attackers will come from the north. Ezekiel 38 verse 6 reads, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands. If you will look at the maps in the back of your Bible, they will show you the lands of Gomer and Togarmah are in southern and western Russia, not in the east in China or India. Ezekiel 38, verse 14 and 15. Therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say unto Gog, Thus saith the Lord God, In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it? And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army, and thou shalt come up against my people Israel as a cloud to cover the land, and so on. This is repeated in verse 2 of Ezekiel 39. And I will cause thee to come up from the north parts, and will bring thee upon the mountains of Israel. So the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39 makes it plain beyond argument that the invading armies of Gog and Magog coming against Israel would come from the north. And yet men quote both Ezekiel 38, the invasion by Gog, and Revelation 16, the way of the kings of the east, and they say, oh, that is one and the same thing, the invasion of old Palestine, and of course they are not. Jeremiah also gave many prophecies of the end of the age battle against Israel by the enemies of God. I won't read all of them as I do not have time, but here are a few which mention compass directions. Jeremiah 4, verse 6, set up the standard toward Zion, strengthen, stay not, for I will bring evil from the north and a great destruction. Jeremiah 6, verse 22 and 23, thus saith the Lord, behold, a people cometh from the north country, and a great nation shall be raised from the sides of the earth. They shall lay hold on bow and spear. They are cruel and have no mercy. Their voice roareth like the sea, and they ride upon horses, set in array as men of war against thee, O daughter of Zion. So this is the last great battle against the daughter of Zion, and Jeremiah wrote that they come from the north. Daniel 11 gives a rather detailed vision of a battle fought by the armies of what Daniel calls the king of the north, 7 times in Daniel 11. In the first part of Joel 2, he describes a great conquering force taking over the entire world. Then verse 11 through 17 tells of them coming against God's people Israel, and what Israel must do to be saved. Then we read in the description of God saving Israel, here called Zion several times, and this is verse 18 through 20 of Joel 2, then will the Lord be jealous for his land and pity his people. Yea, the Lord will answer and say unto his people, behold, I will send you corn and wine and oil, and ye shall be satisfied therewith. And I will no more make you a reproach among the heathen, but I will remove far off from you the northern army, and will drive him into a land barren and desolate, with his face toward the east sea, and his hinder part toward the utmost sea, and his stink shall come up, and his ill savor shall come up, because he hath done great things. Now here in Joel, not only is the army of the great enemy of Israel called the northern army, but somewhat of a description is given of the land into which the army will be driven and destroyed. And it says, a land barren and desolate, and it mentions 2 seas, not one, as there is on the border of old Palestine, but 2 seas, the East Sea, and of course there is no East Sea anywhere near old Palestine. You'd have to go all of the way across ancient Persia, India, and Southeast Asia to the Pacific to get to an East Sea there. And the land between, of course, is not all barren and desolate. And the other sea in these verses is called the utmost sea, and Strong's Concordance says the Hebrew word there means the last sea, or specifically the western sea. And of course there is one land fitting that description, and many other descriptions of Israel's land in the end of this age, and that land is this North American continent. We have an eastern sea, the Atlantic. We have a western sea, the Pacific, and the Pacific was the last sea to be discovered by our race. And in the northern part of this continent, between the Atlantic and the Pacific, is perhaps one of the most barren and desolate areas of all of the earth, northern Canada, and an army driven there would certainly perish rather easily from cold and lack of food or supplies. But whether you go along with me that North America is the abode of the house of Israel today, and the site of the last great battle or not, you can see that the great battle against Israel, according to the prophets, was to be fought by an army coming against Israel from the north. Well, that took so much time, I'll have to leave until next week the explanation of just what the way of the kings of the east and the drying up of the river Euphrates is, here being prepared by the pouring out of the contents of the sixth vial. But I felt you had to be told it was not identical with the invasion of Israel by the forces of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38. Gog and Magog come from the north. Here, something, whatever it is, comes from the east. And I shall explain that symbolism next week, God willing, as we move on closer to Mystery Babylon herself, described in Revelation 17. And I should leave you with this reminder again, and hope you remember this as we read on. John described Mystery Babylon as, quote, that great city that reigneth over the kings of the earth. And he said he saw her drunken with the blood of saints and the martyrs of Jesus. So, Mystery Babylon must be something coexistent with Christianity upon the earth. And Mystery Babylon must be the cause of the death of enough of them to be termed drunken with their blood by John. Mystery Babylon is not and cannot be some great world dictator system which appears only after we Christians are removed from the earth, as so many teach. This is Pastor Emry saying goodbye. God bless you. Read your Bibles and pray for Christian America. This is Pastor Emry. In Revelation 16, prior to the Battle of Armageddon, it says in verse 12 that the waters of the great river Euphrates dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. That prophecy is being fulfilled in this time. Stay tuned.
What is Mystery Babylon? From the book of Revelation, from chapter 15 through chapter 18. We've already seen that Mystery Babylon is a world dictatorship, that she is responsible for the deaths of enough Christians to be called drunken with their blood, and that she will be totally destroyed by the end of Revelation 19. Also, that during her reign over the earth and during her destruction, the Christians will be here on the earth. They are not off up in heaven, gone in some imaginary rapture, as so many teach. In fact, God's people are even called, in verse 4 of Revelation 18, to come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. If the Christians were all gone before Mystery Babylon came to power, why would God send a voice from heaven calling them to come out of Babylon? So it seems to me that believers in Jesus Christ should be interested in finding out just what Mystery Babylon is from which we are to flee. All right, now I'll tell you of the free literature for this month, which you may have simply for writing and asking for it, and then we'll get back to our current Bible study, What is Mystery Babylon? Our January free packet consists of a 24-page illustrated article I wrote several years ago, and which has had wide distribution in America and Canada, and some in other countries, titled Billions for the Bankers, Debts to the People. Once you read this, you'll realize that all of the wars of this century were planned in advance. Yes, planned in advance, and then carried on primarily for two purposes: to destroy some country or some group of people who are opposing the international financiers and at the same time to saddle the productive people of the world with unpayable debt upon which the bankers draw usury. An example of how efficient this is America's own history. In 1913, the U.S. government was less than $2 billion in debt. By 1973, 60 years later, after 2 world wars and 2 smaller, comparatively, wars, the debt had grown so large the bankers were drawing over $2 billion each month in interest alone. This booklet, complete with 13 well-drawn illustrations, will show you how they do it. Billions for the bankers, debts to the people. The second article in the January packet is a 200-year-old sermon we reprinted titled, "Civil Rulers Are God's Ministers." This was preached in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1773 to an assembly of the colony's governor, the King's Council, and the people's representatives, and quite timely for today, I can assure you. You'll also receive Professor Oliver's Christianity, Religion of the West, and we'll send along a list of other literature available, and also that list of over 200 sermons available on cassette tape which I mentioned. This is all free for the asking by writing to me at America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona 85010. Now to our study. Turn with me again to Revelation chapter 16. We have been reading of the pouring out of the vials of God's wrath upon the earth, and we've read down through verse 14 of the pouring out of the 6th vial. In verse 12 it says, "The vial was poured out upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." This is usually taught as a literal drying up of the river Euphrates, so that several 100 million Chinese soldiers can march to battle against the Jews in Palestine. In fact, I mentioned that teaching last week, if you'll recall, and then shortly after that I heard a nationwide radio preacher go into great detail as to how the Chinese, not having sufficient trucks and planes, would have to walk their soldiers across India and Afghanistan and so on to this battle, and couldn't get across the Euphrates unless it was dried up. And wasn't that tremendous that here it was in God's Word telling of the drying up of the river for that purpose? Well, that radio preacher didn't tell how the Chinese were going to cross the Ganges in East India, or the Indus River in West India, or the Tigris before they came to the Euphrates, or 100 other rivers in between, but he was certainly happy that the Euphrates would be dried up so they could cross that. Well, since the drying up of one river on their way would hardly facilitate their 4,000-mile march and the crossing of the other rivers, is it possible that this is not something literal at all? And of course it is not. All of Revelation is given in symbolism. Last week I showed that according to Ezekiel 38 and 39, and according to Joel, the actual army which was to come against Israel in the end of the age would come from the north, not from the east, as here implied with the phrase, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. The word translated here, way, is the same as the one we read in Jude, where Jude wrote, "They have gone in the way of Cain." Jude didn't mean that people had traveled the route or the roadways which Cain walked, but he meant they had gone in the religious and philosophical errors of Cain, in Cain's manner, or in the mode of Cain. The way of the kings of the east is their religious, political, or economic ways or customs. their method of doing things. And we'll see that that is the more correct interpretation of this passage in Revelation 16 by turning to other Bible passages to see the significance of the word east. The word east. Let us use the Bible to interpret the Bible, and the best place to start on any doctrine is in the book of Genesis. Every truth of God's Word begins in Genesis. Genesis 4:16 tells us, Cain was driven from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. Cain went east and left the presence of God. In Genesis 11 is the building of the Tower of Babel. And we read, verse 1 and 2, And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Now the margin of most Bibles will tell you that could have been translated as they journeyed to the east. In other words, they, like Cain, were going east. And in verse 4, And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. These people apparently were attempting to set up a complete control over all of the people, and they wanted to do this so they would not be scattered or lose their power. You know the story. God saw that with their power they would do evil in the earth, and God scattered them and stopped their building. Verse 9 tells us, Therefore is the name of it called Babel. Now almost every person who has ever attended a church or a church Sunday school has learned that story. But many do not know the word Babel here is actually the same Hebrew word translated all other places as Babylon. So this was really the first attempt to build something called Babylon, some sort of a government control apparatus in opposition to God, and it was by the same people moving east. And some of you perhaps can see the comparison to what is known as the United Nations. It, too, is lodged in a tower, a rather tall one located in New York, a city in the east of the United States, and on the bank of what, strangely enough, is called by the inhabitants the East River. And perhaps not so strangely, it, too, is attempting to build a world control system in opposition to God Almighty. You can see why many Bible students call the United Nations the modern Babel or Babylon. In this old account in Genesis 11, it says God confounded their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. In the UN building is proof of this diversity of languages, with almost as many different tongues as there are nations represented there. The UN is obviously anti-Christian and anti-Christ, allowing no mention of Jesus Christ in their deliberations. Now, don't get ahead of me and say, oh, Pastor Emry has identified Mystery Babylon, it is the United Nations. No, I am afraid it is more complicated than that. Obviously, the United Nations is part of Mystery Babylon, but only one of its more visible parts. Anyway, you can see a little of the significance of the direction here, east, in relation to those things in opposition to God. Let's go on in Genesis. In Genesis 12 is God's call to Abraham. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. In this call to Abraham is the beginning and the foundation of all subsequent biblical history and prophecy. For from Genesis 12 to the end of the book of Revelation, the entire Word of God is about God's dealings with the descendants or the seed of Abraham, sometimes called the Israel people, God's chosen people, the covenant people, and so on. Abraham obeyed and left his father's house and journeyed to Canaan, and on the way he set up an altar to God. Verse 8, and he removed from thence unto the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai or Ai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Now I am one of those preachers who believes every passage in the Bible is important. And it is interesting here that Abraham, immediately after his call, built an altar between Bethel, which later would be the place where the Ark of the Covenant was placed, when God brought Abraham's descendants out of Egypt, and Ai, which was the place of Israel's first defeat when they came into Canaan land. Ai to the east, Bethel to the west. And if you read the account of that battle at Ai, in Joshua 7 and 8, you will find that Israel was defeated because a man in Israel took a wedge of gold and a Babylonish garment and hid them under his tent. In Revelation 18, as we read of Mystery Babylon, we find her merchandise listed, and number one on the list is gold. And way back here in Genesis 12, immediately upon receiving God's special call to him and to his descendants, Abraham set up an altar and worshipped between Bethel, representing the Ark of God's covenant on the west, and Ai, the place of Israel's defeat because of Babylon's gold, on the east, interspersing, as it were, himself and God's covenant between Israel and the danger from the east. Yes, Babylon, gold, east, are all descriptions of things in opposition to God's people and to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And my time goes so fast. I wish I had an hour or two. Before I run out of time, and while I am mentioning gold, if you would like a more thorough study on this subject from the Bible, to know whether you, as a Christian and an American, should buy or keep gold, send for my cassette series on Should We Put Our Trust in Gold? This also is 6 sermons, each about 45 minutes long, on 3 cassettes for an offering of $7.50. I cannot cover all of these things on my once-a-week radio broadcast, so if you want a further in-depth study, you're going to have to obtain these cassettes. This is a 4.5 hour Bible study from Genesis to Revelation on the scriptural use and misuse of gold. My address again, America's Promise, Box 5334, Phoenix, Arizona, 85010. Whatever you do, if you are contemplating the purchase of gold, don't do it until you've heard what God has to say about it. Before you think gold can save America, remember, Daniel told the king of Babylon, "Thou art that head of gold." And in Revelation 17, Mystery Babylon is described as decked with gold and having a golden cup in her hand. Because of time, I'll have to be brief on the rest of these. Genesis 13, Lot chose the east country, Abraham the west. Genesis 29. Jacob took his wives, Leah and Rachel, from his grandfather Abraham's kindred in the east, and took them west to become the mothers of the 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. In Judges 6, 7, and 8, the enemies of the children of Israel whom Gideon fought to deliver Israel from captivity are called several times the children of the east. In Judges, Gideon fought these children of the east to release Israel. In Revelation, John sees a vision of something called the way of the kings of the east just before the battle of Armageddon, which destroys Israel's captor, Babylon, in the end of the age. Could they be connected? They are, very definitely. You cannot understand one without the other. In Job and in Psalms, east or east wind is mentioned several times, always with some reference to destruction or evil. Psalm 103, verse 12, As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our transgressions from us. By implication, the psalmist says east and west are greatly separated. Rudyard Kipling wrote, East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. Today, any student of world history knows the differences between the ways of Western man and the ways of the mysterious Orient, or the mysterious East. The world is divided roughly into 2 parts today, those which are under what is erroneously called communism, or some form of it, or the nations of the East, and the other part of the world often called the nations of the West, the Western nations, or the Christian West. The world is round, it is a sphere, and yet ancient custom has given the nations and the people which follow Christ the descriptive title of the Western nations, while those which follow heathen religions are largely classified under the name East or Eastern. Coincidence? Happenstance? Or is it all recorded by the infinite hand of the Creator God, who knows the end from the beginning? In Isaiah 2, we read of God forsaking the house of Israel because, verse 6, they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. Today, the Christian West, including America, is being overwhelmed by the religions of the East, with Hinduism, with Buddhist, with animists who worship animals and trees, soothsaying, or fortune-telling with cards, reading palms, reading the stars, the false science of astrology. We even have classes on Hindu in our schools. We see young Americans in our large cities going around with Hindu turbans on their heads, long robes, and chanting, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Even the religious pages in our newspapers have ads for services at temples of understanding or temples of Krishna, and on and on. A thorough study of the so-called ecology movement in America, with its concern for animals over the needs of the people, will show you that it is founded on the Hindu religion of the reincarnation of man into any animal, and on and on. All of this has its origin not in Christianity or God's Word or in the West, but in the East. Isaiah also wrote, They please themselves with the children of strangers, and we are pleased to set over ourselves aliens and the heathens. We glorify and bow down to the United Nations, which is made up of the Asiatic and colored of 7 continents and the isles of the sea. Instead of honoring God, we honor the heathen. We integrate and intermarry to please the edicts of the communists and of the heathen. And where do these philosophies come from? The Bible says, from the east. Could it be that the way of the kings of the east is actually the mode, manner, custom, and religious philosophies of the Orient? Obviously it could. It is not a physical army made up of 200 million Chinese, as the fundamentalists teach, but an army of alien philosophers and religious teachers who have taken over most of the nations of the world, even invading the Christian West, the land of God's people Israel, and have deceived us into following their heathen philosophies and their vain deceits. And we have even fallen for their false ideology of government called communism, which is destructive of Western man and Western nations. Now, the drying up of the river Euphrates would, of course, also be symbolic and would have a meaning other than the physical drying up of water out of a river bed. And my time is almost gone, so I'll state that quickly, and then we can go on next time. You know that the origin of our Western race and our Western civilization is in the Euphrates River Valley of Mesopotamia, often called the Fertile Crescent. From the Bible it seems probable that the Garden of Eden was either there or near there, and Adam's descendants settled there. It was there that Abraham was born and raised, and from there he was called to leave and follow God. History and archaeology give abundant proof that the people and civilizations of the Mediterranean, of Europe, and finally of North America originated in the valley of the river Euphrates. It is the drying up of our power, of our civilization, of the nations of the Christian West, of our custom and ways of government, of religion and of economics, the drying up of the power of the West, here symbolically called the drying up of the river Euphrates, which is allowing the way or the customs and the methods of the people of the East to prevail. And they have taken over much of the world and infiltrated our own nation, all in preparation for the last battle, just as described here in God's Word. And we'll continue next week, God willing. I hope I've not bored you with those who thought I was just going to talk only of Mystery Babylon. But you cannot understand the impact of Revelation 17 and 18 unless you recognize that Revelation 15 and 16 are the preparation stages for the battle which will destroy Babylon, and that these things are happening right now on the earth in your own country. They are not something off in the future as the churches teach. In fact,